This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bahnsen Institute, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.
Is basic reality spiritual in nature, mental in nature? Is it physical in nature? Is basic reality one in nature or many in nature? Is basic reality moving or unmoving? The Christian has a distinctive answer to all of those questions. The Christian also has a distinct answer to probably the more entertaining and interesting and more vigorously pursued question in ancient Greek philosophy, and that is, how should we live our lives? In ancient Greek society, I'm going to identify for you, well, what should we do in the time we have? I'll identify 7 different approaches to life, and the reason I'm doing that is because, well, the book of Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun, and I want to suggest that those ancient Greeks were struggling with problems and coming up with answers that we keep coming up with today, too. If you're having a tough time, how do you know what is real and what is the nature of reality? Is it in motion, not in motion? Is it one? Is it many? Is it spiritual? Is it physical? And so forth. You might have a tendency to say, well, it doesn't make any difference about all those abstract things. What I want to know is, what's human life all about? And how do I get pleasure? And, it's kind of like, what's it all about, Alfie, right? One school of thought, the sophist, said that there isn't any truth that's absolute. Everything is relative. And no one can know anything for sure. Therefore, you live your life is by getting what is best for you through the use of manipulative arguments with people. That is, there isn't any absolute truth. No one knows for sure. And even if they could, they couldn't communicate. And so when you get into an argument with somebody, what's important is that you use those tricks of the trade will help you get what you want. Now, anybody in class today see anything of the sophist in the law courts of our land? When you can get a hired gun to go out there and say, no one can know for sure, the only thing that's important is that you use your little sophisms in court to prove your side of the case and get your guy off or win whatever you want. We have the sophist with us today. Secondly, in ancient Greek society, they had those who were called cynics. The cynics stressed independence and self-control. The cynics said that the unhappiness that comes in this world arises from society and its imposition of morality upon us. If we could get back to nature and away from the corrupting influence of civilization, then we would be happy. Then we'd be living our lives in a better way. We have to be cynical about the establishment, defy the accepted codes of behavior, live for pleasure, which means getting back to nature. Anyone in the class today see any element of society or over the last few years that were saying the very same thing? Class? Well, yes or no, identify the group. How about the hippies? Would that be close? Back to Mother Nature, away from civilization, defy the establishment. Ancient Greek society had that as well. It had the Stoics, thirdly. Stoics said that people should be indifferent to worldly affairs, exercise self-control, live by reason, and reason should control your passions. And the way in which you conquer the world is by overcoming your own internal impulses. You become stoic by accepting the way nature has brought things about and fitting in with that. Or, if I could use the modern colloquialism, go with the flow. Just chill out, put up with it, stiff upper lip, go with the flow. That's how you fit in. Show indifference to pleasure and pain. Fourthly, we had a school of thought that we still recognize as the hedonist. We still use that term. The hedonist said no one can know for sure, so you live for pleasure. However, there were two different kinds of hedonists. You have the Cyrenaic followers of Chrysippus and so forth, who said to live for pleasure means to go all out. You want the highest amount of pleasure to be maximized. The one who dies with the most toys wins. But on the other hand, you have the Epicurean hedonist. Epicurus was someone who taught that we should live for pleasure, but we have to recognize that if you go all out and just try to maximize the quantity of pleasure, you might not end up very happy after all. You might end up with, if you're a party animal, social diseases, hangovers, and things of that nature. And so, although we speak of the Epicurean lifestyle today as being one given over to excess, according to Epicurus, what you should live for are the gentler pleasures. Conversation with friends, a little wine and cheese. And that'll do it. Quality pleasures. Rather than quantity of pleasure. Sixthly, in Rome we had a school of thought that was called the skeptics. The skeptics are kind of like where you're getting, you know? You look at all this and you say, no one knows. No one can know anything for sure. And then finally, seventhly, there were those that could be called the eclectics, the smorgasbord philosophers who took a little bit from everybody. Hey, I like a little of that, a little of that, a little of that, put it together, and you get fruit salad for your philosophy of life. In ancient Greece, we have seen, therefore, that questions about the nature of reality, questions about how we know what we know, questions about where man fits into the world and how he should live his life, are the same kinds of questions that are being raised today and not being answered adequately today. If we are Christians interested in studying philosophy, we need to come up with not only an internal critique of what the philosophers of the world are saying, but we must be able to come up with an alternative world and life view that answers these problems, gets rid of dialectics. I'd like to illustrate what it would be to do an internal critique of a worldly philosophy. I'm going to choose one that is very modern, so as you take notes, I hope that you'll get a little mini course in apologetics tonight as well. I've chosen as my illustration the philosopher Epicurus, of whom I spoke just a few moments ago. Epicurus is a philosopher that very much looks like your modern 20th century man in the following ways. I'm going to describe his epistemology, I'm going to describe his view of reality, I'm going to describe his ethic, then I'm going to go back and criticize all three very quickly to show you how a Christian philosopher would do apologetics, an internal critique of the unbelieving system of thought. But let's see how modern Epicurus is. As to his theory of knowledge, his epistemology, he said all that we know is perceptual. To know something means you have to observe it. Seeing is believing. That's pretty modern, right? If people say, hey, the only way to know is by observation. You got to have some perceptual experience of things, or you don't know. Don't try to give me this divine revelation stuff. Don't try to give me any authority, intuition. If I don't experience it, then I don't know that it's true. As to his theory of reality, Epicurus was an atomist. He thought all of reality breaks down into basic atoms of reality, of matter. He said all of reality is material in nature and breaks down into fundamental atoms. In fact, even the gods, even the talk of what we call gods, really amounts to a very special kind of atomistic matter, a very fine kind of matter. He wanted to even naturalize the explanation of the gods in the ancient Greek world. Well, how do you live your life if all knowledge is perceptual and all of reality is material, broken down into atoms? I told you already, qualitative hedonism. He said mental pleasure, conversation with your friends, reflection, is higher than physical pleasure. How should you live your life? Avoid pain. Seek the simple pleasures, wine and cheese, conversation. And when it comes to the nature of human life, he said death is nothing to worry about. Since everything is matter, when you die, there's nothing to worry about thereafter. Does that sound like modern philosophy? Eat, drink, and be merry? Whether you do it in the qualified way of Epicurus or in the partying style of Chrysippus, the fact of the matter is you have nothing to worry about because after death there's nothing. Let's go back very quickly as Christians and ask about this philosophy of life. Do we see anything wrong with it? How do you know what you know? Epicurus says what we know is based on perception. All knowledge is perceptual. Okay, I've written that up on the board because the really important question now, if you're going to do philosophy, is do we know that this sentence is true or not? Do we know that it is true that all knowledge is perceptual? Well, according to the theory, if we're going to be consistent with the theory, to know that this sentence is true, to have knowledge of it, is to perceive something, right? And so, does Epicurus know that this sentence is true by perception? Has anybody seen an all knowledge is perceptual? Anybody tasted it? Anyone heard it? I don't mean hear it said. Has anyone heard what it is being described? What is being described here? Does he know this by perception as well? Of course not. In the first place, he doesn't have all knowledge. He's limited. How does he know that all atoms are eternal? That's one of his views of reality. These atoms that make up the material world, they are eternal in nature. How can Epicurus know that? Is he eternal? Has he been watching them? Tasting them forever? You see, on the one hand, he has a very popular theory of knowledge, and on the other hand, he has a very foolish theory of knowledge. If all knowledge is perceptual, then we can't know anything because we can't even know that all knowledge is perceptual. Let's move on to his metaphysic. According to Epicurus, everything is material that breaks down into fundamental atoms. Everything is naturalized. Well, then we have to ask Epicurus, if every material and is subject then to the laws of material nature, then my mind is made up of matter. It is not an independent spiritual reality. It is nothing more than brain material. And my brain material is controlled by the laws of nature and what happens to material things. And therefore, what I think with my brain has nothing to do with the consideration of truth and error, investigation into the facts. What I think is what I have to think because my brain is just part of the natural order. See, very interestingly, if our brains are nothing more but matter in motion, then we have no reason to trust what our brains tell us anyway, any more than we have reason to trust the way weeds grow. I can't help thinking what I think, and you can't help thinking what you think. So why should I choose what I think over what... In fact, I can't choose because if everything is in motion, I don't have any free will by which to choose between what you think and I think. And so you get this interesting paradox that if what Epicurus says is true, there is no reason to believe it. And so his epistemology ruins itself, his metaphysic ruins itself, and let's look finally then at his ethic. He says we should live for pleasure. How does he prove that we ought to seek pleasure? The argument goes something like this. Everyone seeks pleasure, so pleasure is the highest good. Everyone does it, therefore that's what should be done. Sound like a good argument to you? How could you prove that pleasure ought to be the highest good? He may prove that it is. He may show that the vast majority of people live for pleasure, but the question we're asking is, should they live for pleasure? Why do friendship and altruism have the place that they do in the ethical system of Epicurus? Why is it that mental pleasures are higher than physical pleasures? After all, he says the mind is made up of material atoms. So you're just talking about different parts of the material spectrum anyway. So why should one be preferred to the other? How does Epicurus know that there is no afterlife? There's a good one for you. How does he know there is no afterlife? He's living as though there is no afterlife. He should then have a basis for that. He should know it. Why shouldn't we go after the extreme pleasures and just die in the process? Why shouldn't we grab for all the gusto we can get if there is no afterlife? See, there are a lot of incongruities and inconsistencies even within his ethic, buying his fundamental epistemological and metaphysical presuppositions. Okay, so ancient philosophy shows us a number of things. Let me try to summarize them before we take kind of a breather here. Not a break, just a breathing. There's a very important conceptual difference between those two. When we look at ancient Greek philosophy, we have learned that there are certain basic orientations toward a person's view of reality, his view of knowledge, and also toward how he should live his life. We've seen that these orientations usually get the philosopher or school of philosophy into intellectual trouble, creating a dialectical tension that cannot be accounted for as that philosophy tries to build a philosophy of life or a worldview. We've seen that the Christian is able to avoid those dialectical tensions because Christian philosophy is based upon the authoritative revelation of the triune God. Some of these tensions have to do with whether reality is material or spiritual, whether reality is basically one, and reality is basically discrete and atomistic and always changing. Another tension has to do with whether truth is of a correspondence kind of thing or a coherence kind of thing. Whether reason is adequate or whether we have to admit from an irrational standpoint that the human mind is limited and cannot give a comprehensive principle accounting for all things. We've learned as well by looking at the particular illustration of Epicurus that those internal tensions can be exploited to show that the non-Christian does not have an adequate worldview. Even on his own terms, he does not have an adequate worldview. And therefore, by doing philosophy, we are able to fulfill part of the biblical injunction of the Apostle Paul that we are going to beware of vain and deceitful philosophy that is after the rudimentary principles of the world and after the traditions of men. The way we live is by reducing them to rubble, showing that they are inadequate. Proverbs put it this way: answer the fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceits. We need to be better than Socrates. We need to be able to ask the right questions, push the right issues, so that when we're dealing with someone, we can demonstrate that his worldview falls apart internally. Answer him according to his own philosophy. Answer him according to his own folly, so that whether he's Epicurus or Plato or Aristotle, he can see that he has no reason to be proud. He should not be wise in his own conceits. All right, we're going to take just a breather here, and then we'll continue with this lecture. In this last portion of my last lecture, before I open up the floor to questions, I would like to jump ahead in the history of philosophy now. I realize you're getting only a thumbnail sketch, but that's all I intended to do, and it's probably going to be a bit much to digest even at that. But I want to jump ahead from ancient Greek philosophy and some of the fundamental things that philosophers have to answer that I've introduced you to in the previous portion of this lecture, to look at what I think is the turning point in modern philosophy, kind of a new wrinkle on some old problems that you need to be aware of. But first of all, a word about what's called modern philosophy. Modern philosophy does not mean 20th century philosophy. Modern philosophy means the philosophy that dates from the period of Descartes and so forth, all the way back to the 17th century. I know that seems strange. We think of modern as being contemporary, but as nomenclature in the history of philosophy, modern philosophy goes way back there. Now, modern philosophy, it turns out, hinges on the questions of epistemology, the theory of knowledge. How do you know what you know? Those philosophies of the Enlightenment in that period of modern philosophy that talked about human knowledge were autonomous in their character. They did not look to God and authoritative revelation for the foundation of their worldview and how they approach theories of knowledge, but they looked to man to find a foundation for knowledge on his own. And you have two basic schools of modern philosophy, actually two basic schools of ancient Greek philosophy too. Things don't change a whole lot. On the one hand, there are those who approach the theory of knowledge saying that everything we believe is to be justified by means of our experience, our observation. And we call this school of thought empiricism. The empiricist says to know something means that you believe it and you can justify it on the basis of experience or observation. You see it, you hear it, you taste it, you smell it, you touch it. Everything is based on perception. And so modern epistemology, modern view of knowledge, on the one hand says you justify what you know by observation. The other school of thought is called rationalism. Rationalism says that there are some beliefs that can be justified apart from observation and by a means of mental reflection. The rationalist says, don't go look and see, but rather stop and think. Reflect on the nature of certain conceptual truths that we know. Descartes, for instance, said, I know that I exist, and I know that totally apart from any experience of my body or whatever, I know I must exist because I can doubt everything except my existence. Because if I'm doubting, I must at least exist to do the doubting. Therefore, the famous aphorism of Descartes was, I think or I doubt, therefore I am. And I didn't learn that by going and looking at the world. I learned that by going through a process of rational reflection. Okay? So the rationalist school of thought, or rationalism, tells us that we can develop a worldview that is not based solely on observational premises, but on things that we know apart from observation simply by rational analysis. Of course, some of these arguments are not real convincing when you think about it. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. But somebody once quipped, well, he could have equally have said, I stink, therefore I am. Because if I don't exist, I can't stink either, but I don't think that gets to the heart of the problem. Because what Descartes was saying is, whatever I may misperceive about myself, even my thinking, the fact is that all of my doubts presuppose that I'm there to doubt. But then you see later a fellow like Bertrand Russell come along and points out that the question, when Descartes says, I doubt, therefore I must exist, Bertrand Russell says he has already assumed in his premise what he was supposed to prove. Because his premise is, I doubt. But when he says I, he's assuming that he, as a separate entity, exists. What he should have said is, there is doubting going on. Therefore I exist. And of course, once you put the argument in its proper form, you see that it's not very convincing at all. The fact that there's doubting occurring doesn't show that you exist as an individual or an independent reality. So the rationalists sometimes looked rather arbitrary. Their arguments seemed rather speculative and not all that convincing. Oh, but there's something far more embarrassing about rationalist philosophy. And I'd like to briefly describe the three key rationalists of the period: Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Descartes had a particular approach to knowledge, and Spinoza had a particular approach, and Leibniz had a particular approach that we don't have time to describe. But I'd like to tell you what they concluded about reality from their approach. They all said that if we stop and think clearly, we'll arrive at a particular worldview. When Descartes did this, the worldview he arrived at said that reality is divided between minds and bodies. All of reality is dualistic. Some parts of reality are mental, some are physical, and in the case of human beings, there's a little of each. There's a body and a mind somehow within the body. Spinoza, on the other hand, when he approached the question of reality from his very certain rationalistic foundation, he said that reality is not dualistic, reality is monistic, and mind and body are just two different ways of describing the same reality. They are really parallel explanations. When you give a physical explanation, you could give a mental explanation for things. So man is not mind and body, man is mind or body, and it's just a choice between which way you want to talk. Leibniz, on the other hand, said not that everything is one, like Spinoza, not that everything is two, like Descartes, but rather that everything is made up of little bundles of energy called monads. And there's a whole bunch of these monads. Our human body is made up of a bunch of monads and so forth. And these monads are like windowless centers of energy. They're windowless because they don't have any interaction with each other. And the way in which they don't bump into each other or create any problem is that God has kind of a preconceived harmony that he gives to the monads. And so mind and body is just a question of monads organized by God. It's humorous because these guys are saying we can know very certainly things on the basis of reason. Descartes says, I am certain that reality is mind and body. Spinoza says, I am very certain that reality is all one. Leibniz says, I'm very certain reality is made up of all of these bits and pieces of bundles of energy. Well, so much for rationalism. As you could tell, in the history of philosophy, rationalism fell on hard times because it appeared to be so arbitrary. Few people were confident of the metaphysical inferences drawn by the rationalists. That is, few people were confident about the theory of reality that was proposed by these rationalists, whether it was monistic, dualistic, or atomistic. And so we might turn to the empirical side of the board. We have people like John Locke, and Bishop Berkeley, and David Hume, who taught that our theory of knowledge is not to be based on rational analysis, but rather upon human experience, observation of the world. In fact, the empiricists rejected any notion that might be called an innate idea. There is nothing that we know innately. Everything we know is based on experience. But then you know what happened in the history of empiricism is that it turned out that if everything we know is based on experience, then certain things that we took for granted we don't know at all. For instance, human identity. Do you know that you are the same person that is in this picture of you as a baby, or at your senior prom, or at your wedding? There have been changes over time. How do you know that you're the same person? How do you know that you're the same person who came in here tonight? I mean, we all take it for granted. We say, oh, what a silly question. Oh, it's so silly, answer it. How do you know about your own personal identity? Have you perceived it? Have you been watching? It's kind of like, I've had a mirror there the whole time. I've been watching. That doesn't answer. How do we know there are such things as laws or regularities in this world? And here's a real crucial one. David Hume exploited this. He said, science is based upon the expectation that when we learn that B follows A, that tomorrow B will follow A as well. That is, we have a certain kind of experience of the world, And we predict that that kind of experience can be replicated tomorrow. If I stub my toe, I end up saying, ouch. There is a uniformity to experience that, you couldn't have science without that, right? So when you go to the doctor, you have a particular ailment, he prescribes something for you. Do you ever stop to say, well, now, doctor, why did you prescribe this? You can say, well, because in the past we have learned that this kind of medicine helps this kind of disease. And you say, well, yeah, that was, how do you know it will in the future? Well, but it always has in the past. You say, but doctor, you're assuming that the future will be like the past. Have you observed the future, that you could know that the future will be like the past? Now he'd probably say, what are you, a philosopher? Get out of here. Go take the medicine. But you will still have won the argument. Because he doesn't have an answer for that. And David Hume pointed that out. He said, if everything we know is based on observation, then we don't know that the sun will rise tomorrow, that nature will be uniform tomorrow, that our experiences tomorrow will be similar to our experiences in the past. And so by rejecting innate ideas, empiricism resulted in skepticism. You can't know anything about the nature of reality. You can't know about human identity. You can't know about the course of nature. You can't know about any kind of regularity. And so consequently, when we jump up from ancient Greek philosophy to the beginning of the period, what we see is we need a worldview that can save both rational analysis and human experience as sources of knowledge. That is, we need a worldview that can provide the preconditions for both rational and empirical methods of knowing. We don't need a Christian worldview that chooses rationalism or empiricism over against each other. We need one that provides the preconditions, the necessary prerequisites for both, without running into the problems of arbitrariness on the one hand or skepticism on the other. So we might think, okay, that's the end of the lecture, so the Christians win and the unbelievers lose and we can go home now. But I have to give you one little wrinkle before you go home, and that is a fellow by the name of Immanuel Kant. K-A-N-T, Immanuel Kant, who wrote perhaps the most devastating book in the history of Western philosophy, published it in the year 17, entitled The Critique of Pure Reason. You see, Kant was on to the problems of the rationalist, and he was on to the problems of the empiricist. And what Kant wanted to do is to demonstrate that both schools of thought had made a mistake, had not understood the preconditions of human experience, and he proposed not a Christian approach to resolving that, but proposed a different way of looking at the world and human knowing. And what he proposed is so devastating in its consequences that I would do you a disfavor if I didn't tell you a little bit about it before ending. Kant said, what we have to understand is that the human mind is not passive in the knowing process. All along, people have been assuming that the human mind is just there like this slate board, and that experience comes along and writes on it, and we do some analysis by reasoning, and that's how we know what we know. But the mind itself isn't doing anything in the process. It's just receiving information and being worked upon. Kant said that is not right. The human mind itself contributes to the knowing process by forming and interpreting the data that comes to it through the senses. The human mind, therefore, is, as it were, not a blank tablet that is passive with perceptions being written upon it, but the human mind is actually taking the perceptions that come to us and is forming them in a certain way and interpreting them in a certain way. And the human mind applies certain categories. It puts all of our experience into a certain kind of order that is necessary. We cannot help but think the way we do. We have to think in spatial and temporal categories. But that's not because reality has time and space. It's just because that works. Moreover, there are certain analytical categories that the human mind uses. Kant said that we think in terms of qualities and relations and modalities. And one of those relationships we think in terms of is causation. When we see event A causing event B, we don't really see causation. The mind imposes that notion of causation because the mind must think in causal categories. You say, well, what's so important about that, Dr. Bahnsen? Well, what's so important about that is that with this approach to philosophy, what Kant is basically saying is, I can save science, but I'm going to do so at the cost of losing contact with objective reality. I can save science by saying that all of the things we think about scientifically are really just part of the mental apparatus that we bring to our experience. We don't really know reality as it is in itself. We only know reality as we experience it. We're really out of touch with the real world. We only know the world of experience. And what we experience is being contributed by our mind and not just by the world out there. So we don't really know the world out there. And of course, we don't really know God either. God is beyond human knowledge because we can only know things that are temporal and spatial. That's the way our mind works. And so what Kant did, in a sense, is he brought together empiricism and rationalism. He saved science. He showed that causation is a category by which we think. And he left room for a kind of mystical faith that's beyond what the human mind can know. However, the only science that Kant saved is a science that imposes categories on the world rather than learning what the world is from outside. The only faith that is possible for Kant is a non-cognitive faith, not a faith that goes through the reasoning process, because the reasoning process is limited to the here and now and our own experience of the physical world in temporal spatial categories. So here you have a fellow who tries to bring together rationalism and empiricism and save us from the defects of both by providing the preconditions of knowledge. But for him, the preconditions of knowledge are not those given in the Word of God by assuming God the Creator and His revelation, but the preconditions of knowledge are basically no one can really know what the world is out there, and our minds work in a certain way, so we have to think the way we think. This is the success of modern philosophy. Oh boy. Now there are, of course, a number of things that seem very arbitrary and strange here. Why is it that all human categories that they impose on their perceptions? Why is it that all human minds think in temporal and spatial terms? All human minds impose causation as a category of interpretation and so forth. That is, Kant never could explain that really bizarre fact that the human mind is uniform across the board. Why should it be that way? See, even at that, Kant would be forced to some account of a creator who makes the human mind uniform. But you see, what we have in Kant is finally, it seems to me, the declaration that humanistic philosophy cannot come up with an adequate answer to how we know what we know and what the nature of reality is. Kant says that's forever cut off. You cannot know reality in itself. And the way that we think is imposed on us involuntarily. We just have to think that way. And so after the time of Immanuel Kant, you see an increasing pessimism in philosophy. And I don't have time, this short few minutes that are left, to go through all the schools of thought that we come to. But after Kant, we run into a succession of schools of thought that do not have confidence that the human mind can develop an adequate worldview. Quickly, 3 illustrations. Pragmatism says no one can really know for sure, and who really cares what knowledge amounts to if it doesn't have practical value? The pragmatist says to know something to be true is simply to know that it's beneficial, that you can succeed at the things you're trying to do with it. Knowledge is basically success in problem solving. Truth is whatever works. Proof is experimentation. We don't know anything for sure, and we don't even care what certainty is anymore. The only thing that counts is solving problems. This is philosophy. Now, what happens to that worldview that the philosopher is supposed to be developing? For the pragmatist, you don't care about worldviews, you only care about solving problems. Well, naturally, the question arises, what problems should we be solving then? When the pragmatist shows how to live in this world, but does so in a way that doesn't take account of a day of judgment or life after death, is he really being practical? You see, you can't escape the traditional questions of philosophy just by kind of shrugging them off and saying, get practical, let's solve problems. We still have to ask, what problems should we solve? Another school of philosophy that has been popularized in the 20th century is called analytical or linguistic philosophy. Linguistic philosophers are very impatient with what might be called the big traditional questions of philosophy. And what they suggest is the reason why philosophers get all messed up and confused and knots intellectually is that they've really wandered away from the practical, natural way in which we use language. If we only got clear on what we meant by our terms, then we wouldn't even ask questions like, what is time, and are we free, and things of that nature. So here you have a second school of modern philosophy that, for whatever benefit it may have, I was trained as an analytical philosopher, and I think a lot was learned there, but for whatever benefit it may give, it cannot provide us with a worldview and doesn't even try to do so. And then one more illustration, contemporary existentialism. The existentialist philosopher tells us that what's important is not the essence of things, because there is no such thing as an enduring character or nature or preconceived essence for anything. The only thing that's important about us as human beings is that we exist. Existence precedes essence. We are first kind of an absurd, irrational existence. We are into this world, and then we choose what life will be about, what our own essence or character or nature will be. We choose the rules by which we live. The most important thing about human nature is that it is free. It is unfettered by any description, any preconceived nature, any God that can control it. We exist, and then we freely choose what kind of people we will be. The existentialist is very uncomfortable then with the traditional questions of philosophy because they are oriented toward what is the essence of reality, how do you know what you know, and so forth. The existentialist is concerned with human freedom and authenticity, that I decide for myself, and I will make of the world whatever it will be. My reality will be my reality, authentically chosen, usually in a moment of crisis. All I'm getting at here is that pragmatism, linguistic analysis, and existentialism, the three big philosophies of the 20th century, are, in a real sense, anti-philosophies. I get this expression from Francis Schaeffer. This is, I think, a real contribution he has made in pointing out that modern philosophy is, in a sense, abdicating the traditional task and goals of philosophy. Modern humanistic philosophy, without being explicit about it, without running the white flag up, modern philosophy is saying we can't develop a worldview. We can't explain how reality, knowledge, and human behavior work together. And so what we have to do is settle for problem solving, or linguistic clarity, or human authenticity and freedom. But as far as explaining what human life is, the grand scheme of things, what gives meaning to life, what is real, how we know what we know, and how we should live our lives, modern anti-philosophies have given up. And the way they've hidden that is students to more technical tasks and more abstract discussions of things that don't finally get back to the heart of the matter. What is your worldview? I told you already what the punchline was going to be. When you look at the history of philosophy, and when you look at the problems of philosophy, now that we understand what philosophy is in general, I think we come to the same conclusion that the Apostle Paul did in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where he said, where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? When you study philosophy, and I encourage many of you to do so, whether you do it in an institutional setting or not, when you study philosophy, as I have attempted to do, you see in a very real way, you feel the real force of what Paul is saying there. We all need a philosophy of life. We all need a worldview. Everybody is doing philosophy, even though they don't do it well. But what we see at the end of the 20th century is even pretend to be doing it well are giving up the ship. They're sinking along with everybody else, and you don't find anybody coming along offering a worldview that can compete with Christianity. This is a day that is ripe for Christians then to move in and to provide what the unbelieving world cannot provide, and that is an integrated philosophy of life that talks about reality, knowledge, and behavior based on the authority of God's Word. And although there are plenty of people who will despise and reject that because they don't want to listen to God, what the Bible says is true. Fools hate wisdom and instruction. Because they will not bow to the authority of God's Word, they consign themselves to the foolishness of all these different philosophies of life, or the giving up of the very attempt to get a philosophy of life. And it's in this setting that it seems to me we should not be timid or cowardly about our Christian, but without any sense of hubris or pride, we should be very confident and bold that it is now time to proclaim the sovereign rights of Jesus Christ, even in the area of philosophy. I wish I could tell you a whole lot more, but I think I've worn you out enough. Let me take a few moments for some concluding questions. Right down here.
Well, it's not really a question, it's more of a statement. Do you think that in a lot of ways, with the few exceptions of medicine and law, etc., that the educational system has been a kind of a trap drug to pull people away from reality, from God?
Oh, yes. I think the educational system has been something that has drawn people away from reality because it has not been based upon proper presuppositions, has not understood the world as it really is. And in so doing, it has drawn people away not only from reality, but from God's source of reality.
A number of years back, Aldous Huxley, in his book, Brave New World, kind of reached the, I guess, was suggesting his view of the future, that man could finally come into the position of basically not wanting to cope or think or face, and as opposed to like Orwell's view that Big Brother would be controlling us. And I personally think that we moved in much more the line of Huxley's proposition there, or his thoughts of the future. And how do we do that? Understanding a little bit more of what you've spoken of now, how do we do that in a world that I would almost call post-thinking, adverse to really thinking these deeper things that you're talking about?
Well, what you're suggesting in your question seems to me is a parallel illustration of how the modern world in general, schools of philosophy, has given up on the attempt to find an adequate worldview. Because by killing the life of the mind and moving away from intellectualism, as it were, that's an admission of defeat. Intellectualism, the use of the mind, cannot solve mankind's problems, cannot give inner peace, cannot provide what I was looking for in terms of an integrated philosophy of life. Francis Schaeffer, of course, became famous by suggesting that what the modern world has done then is denied reason and is left into, in one way or another, the area of non-reason to find satisfaction, whether it be drugs or the insight provided by drugs or Eastern mysticism or what have you. And I think that analysis is, in a general sense, true. And what you are bringing up in terms of Huxley is just another illustration of that. Okay.
Do presuppositionalists first presuppose the law of non-contradiction? Or do they presuppose the triune God?
Presuppositionalists first presuppose the triune God and argue that if you did not presuppose the triune God, you would have no foundation for the law of non-contradiction. Presuppositionalists see the law of non-contradiction as an expression of the character of God who is true and does not deny himself. So we have a personal foundation for the laws of logic. We do not begin with the laws of logic and then go and find out about God. In one sense, you can say we learn about them simultaneously. In learning about God, we learn about truth. And in learning about the God who is truth, we learn not to contradict ourselves. But the ultimate presupposition is God. Because all of our understanding of logic, you see, is part of a human science, as I put up here on the board. And even our study of logic must be governed by what God himself has revealed to us. Yes, sir.
In the historical view of philosophy, how significant were Cornelius Van Til and
Yeah, the question.
If we look on centuries from now, as exceedingly.
Yes, the question has to do with the significance of Cornelius Van Til in the flow of Western philosophy. And my own personal opinion is that he may not be the best writer in the history of Western philosophy or the most popular, but I believe that what Van Til was giving to us is not perfect, obviously, but is the best expression of the biblical approach to reasoning that we've seen in the history of Western philosophy. It is the most consistent, faithful exposition of that, and therefore it will, because I'm a post-millennialist, it will prove to be, over the ages, a very significant step forward for Christian philosophy. For my money, I would suggest that once a person gets familiar with the basic issues of philosophy, the best way to get a Christian head how to interpret it is to master Van Til's system. That sometimes means not reading Van Til, but some of the expositors of Van Til, just because people find it difficult to read him. But what he was saying, and you can find it in there, I don't mean to say it was totally obscure, but what he was saying, I think, will prove to be the most helpful and powerful tool we have as Christians in our generation. Back here. Yes.
The concept of label Christianity is that he destroyed Christian, he made it impossible to think to rationally explain not a Christian philosophy.
Yes, Kant made it impossible to have a Christian philosophy because Kant made it impossible on his theory for God to rationally reveal himself to man, which would be the foundation of a Christian philosophy.
Because man's mind is not. Because man's mind is only experience-oriented.
That's right. Man's limited to experience, and that experience is preformed, and man's mind cannot be in contact with reality as it is in itself.
But the philosophers that before, there were some Christian philosophers before him who were trying to, you guys were right before Kant.
Yeah, there were Christian philosophers even before Kant who, because they were not presupposing the Word of God, but were rather taking their own thinking as normative. They were autonomous. Their ultimate authority was their own reasoning ability. They did try to come up with a worldview that would be adequate, but they were not successful in doing so. Kant finally said, okay, the game's off, no one can do it. Because the human mind is limited to the experiences that we have in the temporal spatial world. Jen.
Being in academia and seeing how messed up other fields are, which philosophy is the foundation of the other sciences and the other uses of knowledge, that and scholarship is such a mess because philosophy has led the way and messed up.
Yeah, the question is whether other fields of scholarly endeavor are messed up because philosophy is in such a bad state of affairs today. And the answer is definitely yes. Not that everyone looks to the philosophers and says, oh, woe is us, we can't answer these questions. They, for the most part, haven't been self-conscious about it. But the fact is, every field relies upon philosophical presuppositions. How do we know? What is the basic nature of reality? What is human nature? And so forth. And since philosophers have not provided an answer to that, whatever these different fields are doing, whether it be history or biology or astronomy, what have you, they are doing it on faulty presuppositions and unclear presuppositions. Right down here.
Only you be a pure optimist and not fatalistic, and that's something to change and opposed to arrogance would be an insecure pessimist, fatalism, most scientific thing.
Yeah, the question has to do with attitudes toward life and whether a monist would be more optimistic and an atomist more fatalistic. I think if I understand the question. And for my money, I would say you probably cannot draw a meaningful correlation between those. I would say that optimism and pessimism are not necessarily tied to particular views of the structure of reality, monistic or atomistic. There would be some people who say everything is changing, so, woe is us, nothing of value is around. Others would say everything is changing, therefore, things got to get better and better. So that's really kind of an added ingredient to your view of reality is then how do you evaluate what reality is like? Okay, I'll take two more questions and we're going to stop from here.
From your description, I think that I can easily see that the teaching of Kant would have been tremendously attractive at the time when he brought it in. But he probably didn't have time to explain how he might have tried to prove his system. Merely positing that our mind, in essence, tampers with our perceptions is one thing, proving it is another. Did he make an attempt to his assertion?
Yes, Kant tried to prove his view of the human mind in this critique of pure reason by showing that what he said about the way the mind operates is the only way you can account for what the mind does, the only way you can account for science and so forth. And so basically he was doing, this is going to be a very advanced remark, some of you may not catch on to this, but I don't have time to elaborate a lot. What Kant was trying to do is to find the preconditions of human experience. What are the preconditions of reasoning and rational experience and so forth? And so he came up with this plan that basically cuts off from God in revelation. He was trying to do what Dr. Van Til has done. Dr. Van Til says to the rationalist and to the empiricist, what are the preconditions of human experience? And he says they are the doctrines found in the Bible, the triune God, creation, man made in the image of God, and so forth. So Kant and Van Til are, in a sense, I'm being very rough and ready here, we're doing the same thing, Kant doing it in an autonomous way, and basically leading us back to skepticism, I think, and Van Til doing it in a Christian way, submitting to the revelation of God, and showing that yes, we can have science, yes, we can have ethics, yes, we can have logic and human experience and human dignity based upon the presuppositions provided by God himself. Okay, one last question, way back here.
His thing, not what he did. I thought I was reading one, a lot of, they say, like every word of the old at that time. My question to you is, did not then the Christian church, I know there are arguments brought out, like, you have, like, everyone's been called the greatest philosopher that this country ever produced. And yet, when I look at the arguments of the time, and I see what other people have attempted to do in answering it, I ask you the question, is it not so that basically the church compromised and basically take the route of Kant and revolutionary compromise?
Yeah, I think there are two elements to this question I'll repeat for those listening by tape, if nothing else. One has to do with Edwards as a philosopher, a religious philosopher, a Calvinistic religious philosopher. And with that philosophy being available and Kant coming in and kind of cutting things off, didn't the church really abdicate? Didn't the church kind of give up? And then secondly, has the church gone along with Kant rather than answering him? And I would say to the second question, the second element of that question, very definitely. What you see in the history of European scholarship after Kant, attempts to take Kant and to still bring in a Christianity that accommodates Kantian thought and the Bible. And of course, that's like mixing oil and water, I believe. And what that leads to, of course, is a distorted view of Christian faith, a giving up of the Bible in terms of its historical declarations, its accuracy and importance, and really creating a mystical and moralistic version of Christianity that comes into the 20th century as modernistic theology. Very much tied to, without even knowing it, or even agreeing with all details, but tied to a Kantian approach to knowledge and reality. Now, in terms of Edwards, I would say Edwards was no match for Kant. Edwards was a brilliant man. I don't mean to take anything away from him, but he really does not take up or address the problems of Kantian philosophy in any way that I think would be philosophically adequate. Did the church abdicate? Yes, it did.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell notification.
This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bahnsen Institute. Duplication, sharing, and distribution is encouraged. For more information about the life and ministry of Dr. Greg L. Bahnsen, visit our website, bahnseninstitute.com, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.